So let's say now we are very lucky and we have we've come across a perfect buyer for Sam's Sporting Goods. Okay. And so we have buyers now. We want to create a purchase agreement. So we're going to go here to the representation agreement again, right? Because it's got the information, the most information that we need that we can port over. So we go representation agreement, and let's say, here's our purchase agreement we want to create. So the first thing is, what type of purchase agreement are we creating? And we're going to create an asset purchase agreement. Okay, so we can see asset purchase agreement here. Our information has come over, we're the broker for the seller. Now, if you're also the broker for the buyer, then click the box and start filling out additional information for the buyer. So here we have buyer, let's say it's Bob Baker, and he's got a sole proprietorship. So since it's a sole proprietorship, he is the authorized signer, and we can say his email is bobb6677@gmail.com. All right, now Bob lives at 5000 Elm Grove in any city, California. And let's say that's 91105. All right, so, and then Bob, let's see. So the seller broker, this is fee information. So on a purchase agreement, who's going to pay the fees? Or how are the fees going to be paid? And so as far as the seller's broker goes, the fees can be paid in a defined amount or as per representation agreement between seller and seller's broker. So if you put the defined amount, it's going to give you greater of what % of the consideration or a flat rate amount to minimum amount. Okay, because it says greater of. Most of the time, we're just going to say as per the representation agreement between seller and seller's broker. Now, the buyer broker and agent information, again, if you're not representing the buyer and the buyer has another broker and they have an exclusive representation agreement, then, or they have some type of representation agreement, then probably it's going to be per agreement between buyer and buyer's broker. Otherwise, it might be to find, a defined amount, or you may just leave it blank. So the purchase agreement information, we can have our agreement date, and, let's just say that this agreement, that today is the 31st of May. Here are additional assets that are not part of the purchase agreement. So you can see when I click into this box that there's language that pops up over here. This is help information. This is showing you the context of what this is asking you. So essentially, in the purchase agreement, there's information or a definition of assets that says that the assets are going to include all assets of the business of every kind, nature, tangible, intangible, wherever located, yada, 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 right? All the way down. Now, basically, what this is saying is what other assets, if any, are also included in the purchase. And this definition is pretty broad and covers pretty much everything. if you have something specific you need to add in here, though, you absolutely can. And you can also just say, and because it ends in, you can see that it ends in and here. So, and any other assets owned or used in the business operations. Okay. Additional assets excluded from the sale. Again, if you click in here, it's going to give you some help. So the assets being sold shall not include. So if there's anything that's excluded, like the personal vehicles that were on the balance sheet, the owners, I think it was Sam's laptop, and some artwork in Sam's office. I think that's what we said before. All right, and then we have our estimated closing date. So we'll say July 31st. Closing time is going to be at the end of the day of closing. You can do it at the beginning of the day. I prefer the end of the day. Is there a seller note? So here we say, yes, there is a seller note. The breakdown of the consideration is something that's very important. So normally you're going to have, let's say that this offer is for $500,000. Okay. Well, generally we want like a 10% deposit. So we're going to have 50,000 here. Additional cash deposit in escrow upon signing of escrow instructions. Maybe we don't need that because we already have 50,000 deposit. Additional cash deposited 3 days before closing. We might need, maybe he's getting a loan for 300,000. And so the additional cash that's needed is going to be 100,000. Actually, it's not, because Sam was going to carry 50. So, oh no, that's right. So the promissory note is going to be 50,000. Okay. There's no assumption of third-party liabilities. So there's our 500,000 total. Now, the down payments, if you collect, if you have buyers give you the down payment, then, there are some options here. You're directed to deliver the deposit check to escrow, or you're authorized to hold it uncashed until escrow instructions are signed. If you scroll down here, typically I have buyers send deposits directly to escrow because I don't want to be involved with that process. So that's the selection that I typically make. But you have options here depending on your own procedures in-house. Okay. Promissory note details, we can use the default language. So the default language, we had 10% and it was 36 months, I think, 16, 13, 36. So we'll just leave that. If you don't want the default language, let's say you have a promissory note where, it's going to be interest-only payments for 2 years, amortized over 10 years with a balloon payment at the end of 2 years, right? So you can provide your own language. It's just going to give you a blank, and your custom details would go here. So you can enter whatever you want, and that's what's going to show up on the purchase agreement. Okay. So I'm just using the default here. Inventory considerations. Inventory will not be included in the consideration. It will be included. If it is included, how much? There's also another option here. that at closing, consideration and the total down payment or seller note will be increased by the amount of the inventory. So depending on your transaction, it's either not included, it is included, and it may be adjusted, or it's added to the purchase price at closing. All right, so we said that it was going to include 150,000 of inventory, at least in our rep agreement we did. Okay, so if the inventory exceeds the above, the following will apply. The consideration and total down payment will be increased, or the consideration and seller note shall be increased. When there's a seller note, typically it's better just to increase that so that the buyer doesn't have to come up with more cash out of pocket, because that can affect their working capital detrimentally. All right, AR is included. We said no, there's no accounts receivable. And then as you go in and look at the contingencies, so if the due diligence is already complete, maybe, sometimes if you did an LOI before you did a purchase agreement, sometimes the due diligence is done before the purchase agreement is executed. And so you can always check that box if due diligence is complete. Otherwise, let's give it some time frames here. We'll say within 7 days, buyer will request information. Within 7 days of the buyer's request, seller will provide the information. And then let's give the buyer, 21 days to review everything. And in general, I set the time frames for the seller identical to whatever the buyer is. Okay, should either party not approve in writing within X number of days from signing, the other party may terminate the agreement. Well, this needs to be more than the sum of these. So if you got 35 days here, then this can be 35 days or more. And I usually add a couple of days. I mean, we can make it 37, 38, 40, whatever. Okay. Now, within 40 days of signing, or upon closing, buyer shall obtain written consent of the landlord to assign the existing premises or obtain a new lease. So whichever. Then we have our financing contingency. So buyer shall submit a completed loan application to one or more lenders. So we'll just say one lender within 5 days of signing. And the buyer shall obtain a conditional approval letter for third-party financing. Now, in this case, we said there was going to be 300,000 in financing. So we want 300,000, and we want that letter, a conditional approval letter, within 14 days. And we want the 300,000 within probably 45 days, maybe 60. Depending, let's give it 60 days, just because lenders can be a little slow sometimes, depending on their workload. Okay, so licenses, we're still under contingencies. Do we have any licenses that need to be, or that can be transferred and that are contingent? And then list any other contingencies. So we don't really have any here as far as licenses that are contingent. We'll just say NA. Other contingencies and conditions. Maybe if this was a franchise, we would say franchisor approval, but it's not, so we won't. So we'll just say NA. There's none here. Or instead of NA, maybe we say none. where there are no contingencies predicated on transfer or issuance of licenses. So none, NA, whatever your preference is. All right, who is your escrow holder? So we can put in our escrow company. So we can say, we'll make up a name, Cab Friendly Escrow. And, or Cab Escrow Affiliates. Buyer and seller agree to sign escrow instructions that define the duties of each party upon, and you can say within, X number of days of signing or removal of due diligence conditions and whatever else. So, I tend to like to have escrow instructions sooner rather than later. So I want to have them drafted up as soon as the deposit is received from the buyer, so that the buyer and seller can both sign them and get escrow moving forward. Now we have disclosure statements. The buyer and the seller each going to, let's say they will receive the seller's disclosure statement within 3 days from signing. Same thing, the buyer. We'll have the buyer complete the disclosure statement within 3 days from signing. And seller representations and warranties. Are there any exceptions to the reps and warranties? You may not know that at this point. You may need to take a look at them and maybe discuss that with the seller. So right now, we'll just leave this one blank. Now, is this a franchise? Yes or no? No, it's not. Are there any unredeemed gift certificates that are to be assumed by the buyer, credited to the seller? And for sporting goods store, that's a high probability that there is. So we'll say yes. So the seller, and this is going to be typically the individual's name. So we'll say Sam. Was it Sam, Sadie? Well, we'll just do Sam. So Sam Roberts. So the seller and Sam Roberts, because remember, our seller is an entity. Sam Roberts shall train the buyer in the operation of the business. We're going to give him 4 weeks of training at 20 hours per week. Then we want, and depending on what Sadie was doing in the business, you may want both of them in here, seller and Sam Roberts and Sadie Roberts, because you may need training from both of them to some extent. Okay, covenant not to compete. Seller shall not directly or indirectly carry on a similar business, and we'll say within a radius of, 15 miles. Within a radius of 15 miles for, 5 years. So then we have our ancillary documents, and we can add additional ones. So all of these documents, asset list, contingency removals, allocation of purchase price, the buyer and seller disclosure, and then a material contract schedule, these all get added and incorporated during the transaction. So between now and the time the transaction closes, you're going to be dealing with a lot of these documents. And if there are any more that you're aware of, you can click on this to add another document. It'll give you the blank, and you can do that. Okay. We don't have any right now, so we'll get rid of that. So the offer is going to expire unless it's accepted by, let's say, 5 p.m. on What was the offer date? We said the offer date was May 31st. So let's give him, May 31st, 3 business days, probably good. That's a weekend. So let's give it until the 5th, which would be a Monday. Now, right now, this is drafting up the offer on behalf of the buyer. So seller's acceptance is not going to be subject to a counter offer because seller hasn't even seen this yet. Buyer's acceptance, subject to an addendum. Do we need an addendum? Is the bottom line. And if we do, then we want to leave this turned on. And if we don't, then we'll turn that off. So right now we're just going to say we don't need an addendum. We've pretty much got this wrapped up. So let's save it and take a look at it, see what it looks like. All right, so here is our offer and agreement to buy and sell business assets. We dated it May 31st, Sam Sporting Goods. All of our information is merged in. We've got $500,000 paid or credited, $50,000 for the deposit, $100,000 cash deposit by buyer in escrow 3 days before closing, $300,000 in third-party financing. So $450,000 for a total down payment, $50,000 of a promissory note, 10% over 36 months. So total consideration, $500,000. Inventory, it includes $150,000 of inventory. And if the actual amount of inventory is less than the figure, the consideration total down payment will be decreased. If the actual amount is more than this figure, consideration and seller note shall be increased. Accounts receivable is not included. We have contingencies in our contingency period. We're having our escrow established with our CAB escrow affiliates. And we have no other contingencies here. Closing date and possession, estimated closing date is July 31st. All right, so you'll see here that we have this highlighted section for exceptions. And remember, I left that blank. So anytime you leave something blank, it's going to give you an indication like this that it's blank. And so that's good because we need to discuss the reps and warranties with the seller, or just, the offer is being drafted on behalf of the buyer. But ultimately, if seller has already disclosed certain facts to buyer, which affect the reps and warranties, then there are probably some exceptions that need to be written in there, because ultimately you want to be able to present an offer and then have a seller accept it. You don't want your seller to have to counter it over information, reps and warranties, information the buyer already has and already knows about and is already accepted. For example, maybe there's some cash component that hasn't been declared. It's been discussed, and it's just been discussed. So there is reps and warranties in here that basically say all the financials are accurate. All here in 11F, all financial information statements furnished or to be furnished are complete, accurate, prepared in a manner consistent with prior statements, and fairly present all material respects, financial condition of the business. if the seller's already disclosed to the buyer that the information is not complete, accurate, then maybe under exceptions, you just want to say something to the fact that, 11F, that 11F is basically as otherwise, except as otherwise disclosed. So, but it's better to address it here is the point. So your seller reps and warranties are important, and you don't want your seller making representations that everybody knows already are false, because that's just setting your seller up for a lawsuit. Okay, next, go down here. So we have Sam and Sadie, your training. We've got your agency relationships, and we've got, our acceptance, right? And then we have our signature page down here. So you got signature lines for Sam and Sadie and for Bob. Okay. All right. So that is fastest and easiest way to create a purchase agreement from the representation agreement. Now, let's go back up here to the buyer information, and we have Bob Baker, but let's say that his wife is also going to be involved in the business. And so now we need to add another authorized signer. And that will be Barbara. So we have Barbara Baker, and she could be the CFO. And then we'll just copy and paste her email address. So we have Barbara at Gmail. So here we go. Let's save this again and do another print preview. All right, so now we go down here. We have our buyers, Bob Baker and Barbara Baker, both in here. We have spaces for Sam and Sadie to sign. So all of our signature lines are correct. We have agency disclosure here, which also has lines for all four, 2 buyers, 2 sellers. Now note that when there are 2 buyers and 2 sellers, the broker is going to get split up into a second page. She's going to get split off there. And then the civil code's going to go on to a page 3. But that occurs only when there's, when you have buyers and sellers, or actually, I think 2 sellers and 2 buyers. But it could be. All right. So that is a purchase agreement. That's how you draft a purchase agreement. If somewhere along the line, the parties decide that they want to change from an asset purchase agreement to a stock purchase agreement, you can come into here and just go up here and check, switch it over. Asset purchase agreement. Now we're going to stock. Now, there may be some additional information that's required. So as you go through the form, you may need to enter in some other things. Like here, the data, what was the date of the last balance sheet? So if this agreement is May 31st, that's a good date for our last balance sheet as well. Our seller note, that all stays the same. The price may change under a stock agreement, right? But now you have a section for your closing and post-closing adjustments. So your balance sheet value at closing, what was that? Your balance sheet cash at closing and promissory note rate. So there's some additional information if you're getting into a stock purchase agreement here. But nonetheless, it's fairly simple to do that. You'll need to have the parties work with their CPAs, and then you also and their attorneys. So buyers and sellers attorney review is presumed unless contrary writing notice given. And then, you know, this might be a 30-day or a 15-day. You know, how long do each of the parties have to have their attorney review the agreement and approve it? Then you have additional information in here with respect to leases and contracts. Okay. So, and then I'm going to leave a lot of that blank, but just so you can see what this looks like, let's just save it as a stock purchase. And you can do a print preview. And then I'm going to switch it back over to an asset, since that's what we're doing most of the time is asset purchase agreements. So here we have our stock purchase agreement. And you can see all the places where we left things blank. All right. And the same thing with a membership interest. You know, again, if it's an LLC, you want to sell a membership interest, you can change it that way. But like I said, for our purposes, probably 98% of what we're dealing with is asset purchase agreements. So we'll just focus on that. All right. So let's save this. And now we have a transaction going. So when we go back to our dashboard, there's a couple things we can do. So in our dashboard, we can see the different documents that we've been dealing with or that we've created. We go over to manage documents. You can click on a document like the purchase agreement. And now you can see on this purchase agreement how many associated templates there are, right? So from this purchase agreement, we can create buyer and seller disclosures. So we did a seller disclosure once before from the rep agreement, but if we want another one now, the rep agreement could have been months ago, right? So we can create those and they'll end up being attached or related to the purchase agreement. Here's our contingency removals. You can create as many contingency removals as you need. Assignment of lease, allocation of purchase price. So all of these forms can be created and they're going to merge in information from this purchase agreement. Okay. And the other thing that's kind of cool is there's a timeline feature here. So if you scroll down the bottom, you click on a timeline, it's going to show you everything that happened with this, you know, first draft and new document version. Okay. If I go to, let's take a look at, let's go back to my seller rep agreement. And let's say we want a timeline on that. So you can see that there's been, you know, first draft, viewed the document, created a new document version, viewed the document. So there's been a lot of activity on this. But you can see that on the timeline all the way up. So every time somebody, anybody, you know, if you have a broker that needs to review a document and approve it for you before you send it to a seller or send it to a buyer or whatever, you can always tell whether or not it's been done, because you can, well, whether or not anybody's looked at your documents, because you can always look at the timeline. Anybody who's viewed your documents, it's going to show up in your timeline there. Okay. And then again, you can share documents with internally or externally. But I think that's all I wanted to show you on doing a purchase agreement for now.